Ask yourself something uncomfortable right now, and do not look away from the answer. If your life ended today, would you be able to say, honestly and without hesitation, that you tried everything? Would you be able to say that you used every hour, every moment of energy, every ounce of courage that was given to you? Or would there be a dream sitting quietly in the corner of your heart? A dream you kept postponing. A dream you kept promising yourself you would chase tomorrow, next month, next year, always later, never now. That question is not meant to hurt you. It is meant to wake you up, because the world does not wait. Time does not slow down, and the life you imagine for yourself will not build itself while you are busy being comfortable and afraid. Welcome to English to Inspire, the channel where every story is a lesson, every word is a step forward, and every minute you spend listening is an investment in the person you are becoming. If this is your first time here, you are in exactly the right place, at exactly the right moment. And if you want more stories like this one to keep pushing you forward, take 1 second right now and subscribe to the channel, because what is coming will change the way you see yourself and the world around you. Today we are going inside the life of a man who grew up in a small apartment in Sweden, a quiet boy with no famous family, no powerful connections, and no clear path to success. And yet that boy went on to completely transform the way 8 billion people on this planet experience music. His name is Daniel Ek, and if you do not know that name yet, you will never forget it after today. Daniel did not come from money. He did not come from privilege, and the world he grew up in did not send him any special invitation to succeed. He grew up in a neighborhood called Ragsved on the southern edge of Stockholm, raised by a mother who worked hard and a stepfather who loved him, surrounded by ordinary life and ordinary expectations. And yet something burned inside that boy from the very beginning, something that refused to accept that ordinary was enough. That fire, that deep and restless refusal to settle, is the thing we are going to study today. Because that fire is not unique to Daniel Ek. It already exists inside of you too. And the only question is whether you will choose to feed it or let it die quietly. While you wait for permission, the music industry in the early 2000s was broken, bleeding, and full of powerful people who had no answers and no courage to find them. Artists were suffering. Fans were stealing songs out of desperation, and the entire system was collapsing under its own weight, while executives in expensive offices argued about the past instead of building the future. Into that chaos walked a young Swedish programmer with an idea so simple and so obvious that it should have already existed. And yet no one had been brave enough or hungry enough to make it real. Daniel Ek was both brave and hungry. And that combination, as you will see, is the most dangerous combination a human being can possess. His story is your mirror. Because every wall he hit, every door that closed in his face, every night he spent doubting himself and questioning everything. Those moments are not unique to a tech billionaire in Stockholm. Those moments belong to every human being who has ever tried to build something meaningful in a world that rewards comfort and punishes ambition. Stay with this story. Listen carefully to every word, and ask yourself at every turn whether you recognize something of yourself in this man. Because the gap between who you are today and who you are capable of becoming is smaller than you think, and it starts closing the moment you decide to stop waiting. Close your eyes for a moment and picture a 5-year-old child sitting in front of a computer screen in a small apartment in Stockholm, Sweden, not playing games, not watching cartoons, but trying to understand how the machine works, trying to pull it apart with his mind and put it back together again, driven by a curiosity so deep and so natural that it did not feel like studying. It felt like breathing. That child was Daniel Ek, and what was already alive inside him at 5 years old was not just a hobby or a phase that his parents hoped would pass. It was the earliest signal of a mind that was built to create, to solve, and to build things that did not yet exist in the world around him. By the time Daniel was 13 years old, something remarkable had already happened. Something that most adults, with years of experience and professional training, have never managed to do. He had taught himself to code with a level of skill serious enough to build websites for real businesses and charge real money for his work. And he did this not inside a classroom, not with a teacher standing over his shoulder, but alone, with books, with trial and error, with the quiet and relentless discipline of someone who does not need to be told to work, because the work itself is the reward. At 13, while most of his classmates were thinking about weekends and football, Daniel was running a small freelance business from his bedroom, earning roughly $100 per hour, which was more than most grown adults in his neighborhood were making at their jobs. Think about what that means for a moment, and think about it honestly. A child, 13 years old, with no degree, no certification, no boss, and no safety net, was already solving real problems for real clients and being paid serious money to do it, not because someone handed him an opportunity, but because he had spent years building a skill so sharp and so valuable that the market had no choice but to pay attention. Daniel did not wait until he was older to start. He did not wait until he felt ready. He did not wait for someone to give him permission or a certificate that said he was qualified. He looked at what the world needed. He looked at what he could do, and he started. And that single decision to start young and start now set the entire trajectory of everything that would come after. There is a lesson buried in those years that is so important and so direct that you cannot afford to ignore it. And the lesson is this: the skills you build in the quiet moments, the hours you invest when nobody is watching and nobody is clapping, are the exact skills that'll separate you from everyone else when the real opportunities arrive. Daniel was not born a genius in the way that word is often misused. He was not touched by magic or blessed by luck in those early years. He was simply a boy who chose to spend his time differently than the people around him. And that choice, repeated every single day across months and years, turned into something unstoppable. Every hour he spent learning to code was an hour he was investing in a future version of himself. A version that would one day stand in front of the most powerful people in the music industry and refuse to back down. You have hours too, and the question you need to sit with right now is not whether you have enough time, because you do. The question is what you are choosing to do with the time you already have. Daniel Ek did not have more hours in his day than you do. He had the same 24 hours, the same limitations, the same temptations to relax and do nothing. And yet, he chose differently, and that choice made him someone the world would one day be unable to ignore. What are you building right now in your quiet hours? What skill is growing inside you? What future version of yourself are you creating with the time that is passing through your hands today? Because that time is moving whether you use it or not. And the only difference between the person you are and the person you could become is what you decide to do before this day is over. There is a dangerous moment that comes for almost every person who tastes success early. And it is dangerous not because it feels bad, but because it feels incredibly, deceptively good. And Daniel Ek hit that moment harder than most people his age ever do. By the time he was in his early 20s, Daniel had already built and sold a company called an online advertising business that he had grown with fierce focus and relentless energy. And the result of that work was something that most young men only dream about. Real money, real recognition, and the kind of early victory that makes you feel like the hardest part is already behind you. He had proved something to himself and to the world, and that proof came wrapped in comfort, and comfort, as Daniel would soon discover, is one of the most effective traps ever built. With money in his bank account and success already on his record before the age of 23, Daniel did what many young people do when the pressure suddenly disappears and the rewards suddenly arrive. He bought a fast car. He moved into a large apartment. He surrounded himself with the symbols of success that the world had always told him were the destination. And for a short time, it felt like enough. It felt like winning. It felt like the life he had been working toward had finally arrived, and all he had to do now was enjoy it. But underneath that comfort, underneath the fast car and the big apartment and the easy lifestyle, something quiet and deeply unsettling was beginning to grow. A feeling that he could not name at first, but could not ignore for long. The feeling that he was not actually going anywhere anymore, that he had stopped building, stopped pushing, stopped becoming, and was simply existing inside a life that looked good from the outside, but felt hollow from the inside. This is a feeling that more people understand than will ever admit it out loud. And if you are honest with yourself right now, you may recognize it too. That quiet dissatisfaction that lives beneath a comfortable surface. That restless voice that whispers to you in the early morning or late at night when the distractions are gone and it is just you and your own thoughts. Daniel had achieved what he had set out to achieve and discovered one of the most important truths a human being can learn, which is that reaching a goal does not give your life meaning. Only the pursuit of something greater than yourself can do that. And without that pursuit, without that forward movement, even the most impressive achievements begin to feel like furniture in a room you are slowly suffocating inside. The comfort began to cost him more than money ever could, because what it was slowly stealing from him was his hunger. And hunger is not just a nice quality to have. Hunger is the engine. Hunger is the thing that gets you out of bed before the world is awake. Hunger is the force that makes you choose the difficult path when the easy one is right there in front of you. And when hunger disappears, everything that made you powerful begins to disappear with it. Daniel started to feel the weight of that loss, started to feel the difference between a life built on purpose and a life built on autopilot. And that difference was not subtle. It was loud and painful and impossible to ignore once he had truly felt it, like a fire slowly going out inside a person who had always been defined by burning. The price of early success, and this is something very few people will tell you honestly, is that it can make the next level feel less urgent, less necessary, and less real. And if you are not careful, it will convince you that you have already done enough, that you have already proven yourself, that you can afford to coast for a while. And coasting is where dreams go to quietly die. Daniel Ek stood at that crossroads, comfortable and successful and slowly losing himself. And what happened next was not a gentle correction or a quiet moment of reflection. What happened next was the kind of collapse that breaks some people completely and builds others into something far stronger than they ever were before. And for Daniel, the fall was coming. And it was going to change everything. There is a kind of darkness that does not announce itself loudly. It does not arrive with sirens or warnings or dramatic moments that you can point to later and say that was the day everything changed. It arrives quietly, slowly, like a fog that rolls in so gradually that by the time you realize you cannot see clearly anymore, you have already been lost inside it for a long time. And that is exactly the kind of darkness that found Daniel Ek in the period that followed his early success. The money was still there. The apartment was still there. The car was still there. And yet, Daniel himself was disappearing, retreating inward, losing the thread of who he was and what he was supposed to be doing with the one life he had been given. And the clinical word for what he was experiencing is depression. But that word is too small and too clean to describe what it actually feels like to live inside it. Depression is not sadness, and it is important that you understand this, because sadness has a reason. Sadness has a shape. Sadness is a response to something real and specific that happened to you. But depression is different. Depression is the absence of everything. The absence of motivation. The absence of joy. The absence of the ability to imagine a future that feels worth moving toward. And for a young man who had always been defined by his drive and his vision and his relentless forward momentum, losing all of that was not just painful, it was terrifying in a way that is very difficult to put into words. Daniel Ek, the boy who had been building and creating and pushing since the age of 5, suddenly could not find a single reason to get up and do anything at all. And that silence inside him was louder than anything he had ever experienced. What saved him, or at least what began the long and difficult process of saving him, was a decision to strip everything back, to remove himself from the noise and the expectations and the performance of a successful life and go somewhere quiet enough to hear himself think again. He retreated to the forests outside Stockholm, to a slower and simpler rhythm of life, walking among the trees, sitting with the silence, allowing himself to feel the full weight of everything he had been running from. And in that stillness, something began to shift. Not quickly, not dramatically, but slowly and honestly, in the way that real healing always works. The forest did not give him answers, but it gave him space. And sometimes space is the only thing standing between a person and the clarity they have been desperately searching for. In that period of quiet and recovery, Daniel began to reconnect with the one thing that had always made him feel most alive. And that thing was music. Not the business of music, not the industry of music, but music itself. The raw and human experience of hearing a song that reaches inside your chest and rearranges something there. The feeling of being understood by a melody, of having your own emotions reflected back at you through someone else's art. And as he sat with that feeling and let it wash over him completely, he began to ask a question that would change the direction of his entire life. He asked why, in a world full of technology and connection and possibility, was it still so difficult for ordinary people to access the music they loved without stealing it or paying prices that felt unfair and disconnected from reality? That question, born in the silence of a Swedish forest during one of the lowest and most painful periods of his life, was the seed of everything that Spotify would become. And it is a reminder that some of the greatest ideas in human history did not come from boardrooms or universities or moments of comfort and celebration. They came from the broken places, from the quiet after the crash, from the painful and necessary experience of losing yourself completely and then having to find out who you really are when everything else has been taken away. You have been in dark places too. Perhaps you are in one right now. And what Daniel's story is asking you to understand is that the darkness is not the end of your story. It is very often the beginning of the most important chapter you will ever write. There is a moment in every great story where the pain stops being just pain and starts becoming purpose, where the suffering that felt like it was destroying you reveals itself to have been preparing you all along. And for Daniel Ek, that moment arrived, not with fanfare or celebration, but with a simple and burning clarity that cut through everything else and left only one undeniable truth standing in its place. The music industry was broken, not slightly damaged or in need of small adjustments, but fundamentally, completely, and catastrophically broken in a way that was hurting everyone it touched, hurting artists who could not get paid fairly for their work, hurting fans who loved music deeply, but had no honest and affordable way to access it, and hurting the entire culture of human creativity that music had always represented and protected. Daniel saw this not as a problem to avoid, but as the greatest opportunity of his generation. And that shift in perspective, from seeing a broken system as a barrier to seeing it as an invitation, is one of the most powerful mental transformations a human being can make. The year was around 2006. And the context matters enormously because without understanding what the world looked like at that moment, you cannot fully appreciate how bold and how necessary Daniel's idea actually was. Napster had risen and fallen, taking with it the illusion that the old music industry model could survive the internet, and in its wake came a chaotic landscape of illegal downloading, desperate lawsuits, and an industry full of powerful people who were so busy trying to protect the past that they had completely abandoned any responsibility for building the future. iTunes existed and offered legal downloads, but buying individual songs or albums still required money that many people did not want to spend on music they were not sure they would love. And the result was a generation of music lovers who had been essentially pushed into piracy not by greed but by a system that offered them no reasonable alternative. Daniel's idea was so elegant and so obvious in hindsight that it almost feels too simple to have changed the world. But the greatest ideas almost always feel that way after someone has already had the courage to make them real. The idea was this: what if music did not need to be owned at all? What if instead of buying songs, you could simply access all of them, every song ever recorded by every artist who ever lived, instantly and legally, and for a price so low and so fair that stealing would feel not just dishonest but genuinely unnecessary? The concept of music streaming was not entirely new as a theoretical idea, but nobody had ever built it in a way that was fast enough, legal enough, and good enough to actually replace the habit of piracy for real people, living real lives, with real impatience and real expectations. Daniel sat with this idea, and felt something he had not felt in a long time. The specific and unmistakable electricity of a vision so large and so necessary that it demands to be built. The feeling of a purpose that is bigger than comfort, bigger than fear, bigger than the opinions of every person who will tell you it cannot be done. He understood instinctively that the key to making this work was not fighting human behavior, but working with it. Not lecturing people about why stealing was wrong, but simply offering them something so good and so convenient that the honest choice became the obvious choice. And that insight, that deep and empathetic understanding of how human beings actually behave rather than how we wish they would behave, was the philosophical foundation on which Spotify would be built. What Daniel was doing in those early days of clarity and vision was something that every person with a dream must eventually learn to do, which is to look directly at the size of the problem in front of you, without flinching, without minimizing it, without pretending it is smaller than it is, and then choose to walk toward it anyway. Not because you are certain you will succeed, but because you cannot imagine choosing not to try. The music industry was a mountain, and Daniel Ek was one young man with a laptop and an idea and a hunger that had been sharpened by darkness and silence and pain. And he looked at that mountain and felt not fear, but recognition. The recognition that this was exactly what he had been built for. And he began to move toward it with everything he had. There is a specific kind of courage that does not look like courage from the outside. It does not look like a soldier charging into battle or an athlete pushing through physical pain in front of a roaring crowd. It looks much quieter and much more ordinary than that. It looks like a young man sitting across a table from powerful and skeptical people, hearing the word no for the 10th time in a row. Standing up, walking out of the room, and then coming back the next day to try again with the same belief and the same energy, and the same unshakable conviction that he had carried into every meeting before that one. That is the kind of courage Daniel Ek needed in the years between having the idea for Spotify and actually bringing it to life. And the resistance he faced was not a small inconvenience or a minor obstacle. It was a wall built by the most powerful people in one of the most powerful industries in the world. The major record labels controlled everything that mattered in the music business. They controlled the catalogs, they controlled the licensing rights. They controlled access to the songs that any streaming service would need in order to be worth using. And they were not interested in handing that control to a young Swedish programmer with an unproven idea and no track record in the music industry. The labels had already watched Napster destroy their business model once, and their response to that trauma was not to adapt and evolve, but to defend and resist, to build higher walls and sharper legal weapons, and to treat every new technology platform that approached them not as a potential partner but as a potential thief in slightly more professional clothing. Daniel walked into that environment with his idea and his data and his vision and was met with suspicion, dismissal, and a level of institutional resistance that would have ended the journey for most people before it truly began. The meetings were brutal in the specific way that polite rejection can be brutal, when nobody screams at you or tells you directly that you are foolish, but instead they smile carefully and ask questions designed to expose every weakness in your plan and then thank you for your time, in a tone that makes it very clear that your time was not particularly valuable to them. Daniel heard every version of no that the English language offers. He heard it is too risky. He heard the market is not ready. He heard we tried something similar and it failed. He heard you are too young and too small and too unknown to be trusted with something this important. And every single time he heard those words, he did something that is almost superhuman in its difficulty. He chose not to believe them, not because he was arrogant or blind to the real challenges ahead, but because he understood something about conviction that most people never learn, which is that your belief in your idea must always be stronger than other people's doubt about it, or the idea will never survive long enough to prove itself. Martin Lorentzen, who co-founded Spotify alongside Daniel, was a crucial presence in those difficult years. A partner who shared the vision and helped carry the weight of the endless rejection and the relentless negotiation, and together they pushed forward through a process that took years of conversations, compromises, legal frameworks, and trust building. before the first major label agreed to come on board. Daniel learned to speak the language of the industry he was trying to transform, learned what the labels truly feared and what they truly needed, and slowly and painstakingly built a case that was not just about technology or user experience, but about survival, making it clear to the people across the table that Spotify was not the threat to their business. The ongoing tsunami of piracy was the threat, and Spotify was the only serious solution anyone had yet proposed. Every no that Daniel received in those years was doing something to him that the people saying no did not intend and could not see. Every rejection was adding another layer of hardness and clarity and precision to his vision, stripping away every weak element of his plan and forcing him to rebuild it stronger. And this is the hidden gift inside every wall you have ever hit in your own life. Every person who told you that your dream was unrealistic, every door that closed in your face, every moment you wanted to quit and did not. All of that was building something inside you, hardening something, sharpening something. And the question you need to ask yourself right now is not how many times you have been told no. The question is whether you are still in the room, still making the case, still refusing to accept that the wall in front of you is permanent. Because walls that look permanent have a way of suddenly developing doors for the people who are stubborn enough to keep knocking. There is a difference between having an idea and building an idea, and that difference is everything. Because the world is absolutely full of people who have brilliant ideas. People who lie awake at night with visions of what could exist, and what should exist, and what the world would look like if only someone would create it. And yet most of those ideas die quietly in the dark, because the person who had them never made the terrifying and exhausting leap from imagining to actually building. From the clean and comfortable world of vision to the messy and brutal and deeply unglamorous world of execution. Daniel Ek made that leap. And what waited for him on the other side was not glory or excitement or the cinematic montage of success that we imagine when we think about building something great. What waited for him was work. Relentless and obsessive and all-consuming work that demanded everything he had and then asked for more. The Spotify office in Stockholm in those early years was not a glamorous place. It was a small and crowded space filled with young engineers and designers and product thinkers who were working at the kind of pace that most people experienced only in short bursts during a crisis. But that Daniel insisted on maintaining as a permanent state of being, because he understood with absolute clarity that the window of opportunity they had was not going to stay open forever, and that speed and quality together, not one without the other, were the only things that could get them through it in time. Daniel was obsessive about the product in a way that his team felt every single day. Not in a cruel or unreasonable way, but in the way that a person is obsessive when they genuinely believe that what they are building matters. When the stakes feel real and the mission feels urgent and every hour of substandard work feels like a personal betrayal of something important. The technical challenge alone was enormous, because what Daniel wanted to build was not just a library of songs on the internet. Anyone could build that. What he wanted to build was something that felt instant. Something that felt so fast and so seamless and so natural that using it would feel less like operating a piece of technology and more like having all the music in the world living inside your own head, available at the exact moment you wanted it, with zero friction and zero waiting. He wanted Spotify to feel like magic. And making something feel like magic requires an almost insane level of attention to the details that most people never notice. The fraction of a second difference in load time. The way a recommendation feels personal, rather than out. The small and invisible decisions that separate a product people tolerate from a product people genuinely love and cannot imagine living without. Daniel built a culture inside Spotify that reflected his own deepest values, a culture that took the mission seriously without taking itself too seriously, that moved fast but cared deeply about quality, that encouraged disagreement and debate as signs of intellectual health rather than threats to authority, and that treated the people building the product not as resources to be managed, but as human beings whose creativity and energy were the most valuable assets the company possessed. He believed, and demonstrated through his own behavior every single day, that great products do not come from committees or compromises or the careful management of risk. They come from people who care deeply, who feel personally responsible for every detail, who lie awake at night thinking about how to make something better, not because their boss told them to, but because their own standards demand it. The years of building Spotify were years of sacrifice that Daniel has spoken about with honesty and without years of missed social events and strained relationships, and the specific loneliness that comes from being so consumed by a mission that ordinary life begins to feel like an interruption rather than the point. And this is not something to romanticize or to recommend without reservation, because the cost of building something great is real, and it falls not just on the builder but on everyone around them. But it is something to understand clearly if you are serious about creating anything meaningful in your own life. The question Daniel asked himself every morning was not whether the sacrifice was comfortable. It was whether the thing being built was worth it. And every morning, his answer was the same. It was worth it. It was more than worth it. And that answer, repeated with conviction through years of difficulty and doubt, is what eventually turned a small Stockholm office full of tired and passionate people into something the entire world would one day open their phones to find. There are moments in history that only reveal their true size long after they have already happened. Moments that feel significant in the instant they occur, but whose full weight and meaning only become clear when you step back far enough to see everything they set in motion. And the launch of Spotify in October of 2008 was exactly that kind of moment. Quiet enough on the surface to be easily underestimated, but carrying inside it the seed of a transformation so complete and so permanent that the world of music before Spotify and the world of music after Spotify are genuinely two different worlds separated by a single decision made by a young man who refused to accept that the broken thing could not be fixed. The launch was initially limited to Europe, available by invitation only, and yet the reaction from the people who gained access was immediate and visceral and deeply telling, because they did not respond with polite appreciation or cautious enthusiasm. They responded with the specific and overwhelming relief of people who had been waiting for something without knowing exactly what they were, waiting for until the moment had finally arrived. The early users of Spotify described the experience in language that sounded less like product reviews and more like personal testimonies, talking about the feeling of having an entire universe of music open up in front of them, instantly, and legally, and beautifully. Talking about discovering artists they had never heard before through recommendations that felt genuinely personal. Talking about the simple and profound joy of typing the name of any song they had ever loved and hearing it begin to play within seconds without costs or complication or guilt. Daniel had bet everything on a fundamental belief about human nature. The belief that people do not steal because they are dishonest, but because the honest option was never good enough. And the response to Spotify's launch confirmed that belief in the most direct and undeniable way possible. Because as soon as the honest option became genuinely better than the dishonest one, millions of people chose it without hesitation and never looked back. The growth that followed was not the slow and grinding growth of a product struggling to find its place in the market. It was the explosive and self-sustaining growth of something that solves a real and deeply felt human problem so completely that every person who experiences it immediately wants to share it with everyone they know. And that word of mouth, that organic and unstoppable spreading of genuine enthusiasm from one person to the next, is the most powerful marketing force that has ever existed, and the one that no amount of advertising budget can manufacture or replace. Daniel had understood from the very beginning that if the product was truly great, the product would sell itself. And Spotify proved that understanding correct in a way that exceeded even his own most optimistic projections, growing from hundreds of thousands of users to millions and then to tens of millions in a time frame that shocked even the people who had believed in it most deeply. The music industry, the same industry that had spent years telling Daniel his idea was dangerous and naive and impossible to execute responsibly, began to see something in those growth numbers that it had not seen in a very long time. And that something was hope. Streaming revenues began to rise as piracy rates began to fall. Artists began to reach audiences in countries and cities and communities they had never been able to reach before, and the conversation inside the industry slowly and reluctantly shifted from resistance and suspicion to something resembling cautious partnership. Not because the labels had suddenly become visionary or courageous, but because the evidence in front of them was impossible to argue with, and the alternative to embracing Spotify was watching the piracy problem continue to consume everything they had spent decades building. Daniel had not just built a product, he had changed the terms of an entire debate. And that is a rare and significant thing to be able to say about any human endeavor. What the launch of Spotify teaches you, and what you need to carry with you long after this story is finished, is that solving a real problem with a real solution that genuinely respects the intelligence and the humanity of the people it serves is not just a good business strategy. It is a form of integrity, a declaration that you believe people deserve better than what they have been given and that you are willing to do the hard and unglamorous work of actually giving it to them. Daniel did not launch Spotify because he wanted to be famous or because he wanted to be rich. He launched it because he genuinely believed that music was a fundamental human need, and that the system standing between people and that need was wrong and fixable. And that clarity of purpose, that deep and honest reason for doing what you are doing, is the difference between building something that lasts and building something that merely succeeds for a while before disappearing into a rut. There is a particular kind of battle that begins only after you have already won. A battle that is in many ways harder than the one that came before it, because the enemy is no longer outside you, pushing you to prove yourself. The enemy is now the weight of your own success, the expectations of millions of people who depend on what you have built, the voices of critics and competitors and artists and journalists and shareholders, all pulling in different directions at once. And Daniel Ek discovered the true dimensions of that battle in the years following Spotify's explosive growth. Years that tested not his ability to build, but his ability to lead, to defend, to absorb punishment, and keep moving forward with his vision intact. Success, as Daniel learned in ways both public and painful, does not silence your critics. It amplifies them. Because now, there are more people watching. More people with opinions. And more people who feel personally invested in telling you everything you are doing wrong. The criticism came from directions that Daniel had not fully anticipated. And the most painful of it came not from competitors or industry executives, but from the artists themselves. The very people whose music Spotify had been built to celebrate and protect and bring to the world. Taylor Swift pulled her entire catalog from the platform in 2014 in a move that sent shockwaves through the industry and focused a global conversation on the question of whether streaming services were paying artists fairly, and she was not alone in her concerns. As musicians from across the spectrum of fame and genre began to speak publicly about royalty rates that felt insulting relative to the billions of dollars that Spotify was generating as a business, Daniel found himself standing at the center of a storm that was simultaneously about economics and ethics and power, and the fundamental question of who deserves to benefit when technology transforms a creative industry. Daniel did not respond to this criticism with defensiveness or dismissal, but he also did not collapse under it, or abandon the principles that had guided his vision from the beginning. And the balance he tried to maintain between those two responses, between standing firm and staying open, between defending his model and genuinely hearing the pain behind the complaints, is one of the most instructive things about his leadership during this period. He acknowledged that the transition from a world of album sales to a world of streaming meant that the mathematics of artist compensation had fundamentally changed, and that those changes created real hardship for real musicians who had built their careers and their financial expectations around a model that no longer existed. And he committed to working toward solutions, while also making the case that the alternative to streaming was not a return to healthy album sales, but a continuation of the piracy that had been destroying artist income long before Spotify arrived. The competitive pressure during these years was also relentless, and came from opponents with resources that dwarfed anything Spotify could match, because Apple launched Apple Music in 2015 with a full weight of one of the most powerful companies in human history behind it. And Amazon and Google were not far behind. each of them entering the streaming space with existing ecosystems and existing customer relationships and existing financial advantages that should have made Spotify's position precarious and potentially fatal. Daniel responded to this pressure, not by panicking or by trying to compete on the terms his competitors had chosen, but by doubling down on the thing that Spotify had always done better than anyone else, which was understanding music listeners at a level of depth and empathy that a technology company building a music feature could never fully replicate. Because for Apple and Amazon, music was a product extension, while for Daniel Ek, music was the entire point and always had been. The battles of those years, the artists' controversies, and the competitive wars and the public scrutiny and the internal pressures of leading a company, growing at a speed that constantly threatened to outpace the systems and the culture that held it together. All of those battles were teaching Daniel something that the early victories had not been able to teach him, which is that vision without endurance is just a beautiful beginning with no middle and no end. That the willingness to fight for something when the fighting stops being exciting and starts being exhausting is the quality that truly separates the people who change things from the people who merely start things. And this lesson belongs to you as much as it belongs to Daniel Ek, because whatever you are building, whatever you are fighting for, whatever dream you are carrying through the resistance and the doubt and the criticism of people who do not understand it yet, the question is never whether the battle will be hard. The question is always whether you love the thing you are fighting for enough to keep fighting when every reasonable voice in your head is telling you that you have already done enough. Here you are, at the end of Daniel Ek's story, and the question is not whether you found it interesting or whether you learned something about the music industry or about Swedish entrepreneurs or about the mechanics of building a technology company. The question is what you are going to do right now, today, with the hours that are still left in this day. Because Daniel Ek's story was never really about Daniel Ek. It was about you. It was a mirror held up to your face so that you could see yourself more clearly. See your excuses more clearly. See the distance between where you are and where you are capable of going more clearly. And now that you have seen it, you cannot unsee it. And that means the responsibility sitting on your shoulders right now is heavier than it was when you pressed play at the beginning of this story. Daniel Ek started with nothing that you do not also have. He had curiosity, and he fed it. He had time, and he used it. He had a vision, and he protected it through years of rejection and darkness and doubt and competition and public criticism and private fear. And he never once allowed the noise of other people's opinions to become louder than the signal of his own deepest conviction. He was not fearless. Nobody who has ever built anything real was fearless. He was afraid, and he moved anyway. He doubted, and he built anyway. He was told no so many times that a lesser person would have accepted no as the final answer and found a comfortable life inside that acceptance. And he refused. Simply and completely and permanently refused to let other people's limitations become his own. Think about the version of yourself that exists 10 years from now. If you change nothing today, if you keep waiting for the right moment, the right conditions, the right amount of confidence, the right sign from the universe that it is finally safe to begin. That version of you is living inside a life built from postponed decisions and swallowed courage and dreams that were never given the dignity of a real attempt. And that life is not a tragedy in the dramatic sense. It is a tragedy in the quiet sense. The kind that does not announce itself loudly, but simply accumulates day after day until one morning you wake up and realize that the window has closed and the time has passed and the person you are capable of becoming is no longer available to you. That is the future that waits for people who keep choosing comfort over courage. And you know it, and knowing it means you have no more excuses left. Now think about the other version. The version of you that starts today, not with a perfect plan or a guaranteed outcome or the approval of everyone around you, but simply with a decision to begin to take the first uncomfortable step in the direction of the thing that burns inside you. To treat your own dream with the same seriousness and the same commitment and the same ferocious daily investment that Daniel Ek gave to his. That version of you is also available. It is available right now, in this moment. And the only thing standing between who you are and who you could become is a single decision made with enough conviction to survive the first wave of doubt that will inevitably follow it. You have heard the story. You have felt the weight of it. You know what is possible for a person who refuses to settle. The world does not need another person who had a dream and did nothing with it. The world has enough of those already. What the world needs, what it is waiting for, and has always been waiting for, is a version of you that decides today is the day, that the waiting is over, that the excuses are finished, that the life you were born to build is not going to build itself, and nobody is coming to build it for you. Daniel Ek sat in a forest in Sweden feeling broken and lost, and found inside that silence the seed of something that changed the world. You have your own silence. You have your own seed. The only question left is whether you will have the courage to plant it. The clock is moving. It has always been moving, and it will never, not once, not for anyone, wait.